Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Wyoming. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. Let's begin. The year was 1874, a restless time on the high plains. Wyoming was still a territory, not yet a state, and the land rolled vast and treeless beneath a sky so wide it seemed to swallow sound. Towns were young, laws were thin, and the nearest marshal might be days away. According to early accounts preserved in county registers and later echoed in references like the Wikipedia entry on the American frontier, this era was one of endurance, when survival itself blurred with solitude. South of the Laramie Range, tucked between gulches and dry creek beds, lay a half-forgotten settlement called Gold Creek Hollow. It wasn't on most maps, but traders and drifters knew it as a stop for whiskey, repairs, and a warm meal before pushing farther into mining country. The main street boasted only 4 structures: a blacksmith shed, a livery stable, a church no bigger than a barn, and a leaning saloon whose sign read Sagebrush Station. The saloon had a dark reputation. Locals whispered that its last proprietor, Eben Carver, had vanished the previous spring without collecting his earnings. The building sat empty until midsummer, when a new man arrived, tall, red-bearded and soft-spoken, calling himself Jonas Red McAllister. He claimed to have purchased the property outright with savings from rail work in Utah. No one questioned him. Men came and went often on the frontier, and those who asked too much sometimes disappeared themselves. McAllister reopened the saloon under a new name, McAllister's House. He fixed the shutters, polished the bar, and hung a small bell over the door. The first night, a handful of travelers came in for supper. Cornbread, venison stew, and rye whiskey served in cracked glass tumblers. By closing time, they swore it was the cleanest, quietest place they'd stayed in months. For a brief moment, it seemed Gold Creek Hollow might prosper. But those who knew the rhythm of frontier life sensed something amiss. The inn's lamps burned late, sometimes until dawn. Strange freight was delivered from the rail depot, barrels that McAllister unloaded himself, never allowing help. Miss Lillian Hayes, who tended the kitchen, wrote in a private journal that the cellar smelled of iron and smoke. "He says he's keeping meat cool for winter," she noted, "but no butcher I know seals meat in pitch." In that same journal, Hayes mentioned how McAllister seemed to study his guests rather than serve them. He asked too many questions about their roots, whether family expected them soon. "When he smiles," she wrote, "it's as if he's already thought through how the story ends." Later historians comparing small-town disappearances in frontier settlements cited this case as emblematic of the lawless undercurrents of the American frontier, where isolation bred both opportunity and terror. The territory offered freedom and concealment. By the close of that year, the inn had gained a reputation: fine whiskey, hearty meals, and a host who never turned away a traveler. But behind those walls, something darker stirred, waiting for the thaw of spring to reveal its truth. The first weeks of McAllister's ownership passed quietly, though some townsfolk claimed the silence itself felt unnatural. In a frontier town, noise meant life: hammering, horses, laughter, the endless shuffle of boots across planks. But inside McAllister's house, sound seemed to die too quickly, as though the walls absorbed it. Travelers described Jonas McAllister as courteous but detached. He rarely drank, never gambled, and kept meticulous notes in a small leather ledger. When asked about his past, he'd smile and answer vaguely, "Rail work, bit of mining, bit of trouble." That was enough for most. On the American frontier, men came from everywhere and told little truth. It was a land of second starts and hidden sins, a fact well documented in historical accounts, such as those later summarized in the Wikipedia entry on the American frontier. Miss Lillian Hayes, meanwhile, kept the saloon tidy and the hearth burning. Her journals tell more than any official record. She wrote how McAllister would spend long hours in the cellar, emerging with sawdust on his boots and the faint odor of kerosene on his hands. He claimed to be repairing foundation timbers, though no one had seen the supplies arrive. On May 9, 1874, a cattle driver named Hap Lovell lodged for the night and was last seen heading down the hall toward his room after closing. The next morning, McAllister told patrons Lovell had left early to meet a wagon train east of town. No one doubted it until 2 days later, when Lovell's horse was found tethered and starving behind the livery. Constable Samuel Bingham, a mild man with limited authority, questioned McAllister briefly. "He paid his bill and said he'd fetch his mount later," McAllister explained, eyes steady. The constable accepted it, noting in his sparse logbook, "No cause for alarm. Drifter presumed gone." It was the kind of entry that buried more than it revealed, but rumors travel faster than truth. Within a fortnight, 2 prospectors vanished after sharing supper at McAllister's house. One of them, Thomas Reed, had left his gear behind: pickaxe, tin cup, even his wages. Again, no alarm was raised. As Miss Hayes recorded, "Out here people disappear like the wind. We speak of them for a week, then we forget." Still, something about the saloon's cellar gnawed at her. She wrote how McAllister forbade anyone from entering after sundown, claiming it was unsafe with open beams. Yet she often heard a scraping noise below, steady and deliberate, as though someone were dragging something heavy across the dirt. By midsummer, even the stray dogs avoided the back alley behind the inn. "Animals sense what men excuse," she noted in one haunting line. Later historians studying these accounts, particularly in comparison with other unrecorded frontier crimes, some cited in Wikipedia's summary of frontier justice, observed how such isolation created the perfect cover. Law, rumor, and fear often mixed, until no one could tell them apart. Gold Creek Hollow carried on, half blind to what was happening in its heart. And each evening, as dusk pooled over the plains, a soft yellow glow appeared in the saloon window, a beacon to travelers who, by morning, were nowhere to be found. By August of 1874, the people of Gold Creek Hollow had grown used to their quiet unease. Travelers still came, drawn by the promise of warmth and whiskey, and most left in good spirits. But a few, always strangers, never locals, vanished without explanation. McAllister kept his polite smile, his careful books, and his calm routine, as if nothing unusual ever occurred. Constable Bingham began keeping private notes beyond his official log. In one entry, dated August 14th, he wrote, "Too many gaps in the saloon ledger. Mr. McAllister's count of rooms seldom matches the number of guests seen entering." Yet, without bodies or evidence, there was little he could do. This was the American frontier, after all, an age of distance, silence, and missing men. Historians later describe such disappearances as a shadow side of progress, a truth echoed in the Wikipedia reference on the American frontier, which reminds us how isolation often masked the darker instincts of survival. One evening, a freighter named Caleb Wren stopped for supper after a long haul north from Fort Collins. He told Miss Hayes he'd heard strange talk down the line, that travelers headed this way were not reaching the next town. She laughed it off, though her eyes betrayed fear. That night, as she cleared the tables, Wren noticed something peculiar. Beneath the saloon's floorboards, the lantern light wavered, as if from another flame below. He asked McAllister about it. "Old coal pit," came the answer, smooth and practiced. "Vent still open. Nothing more." Yet as Wren retired to his room, he swore he heard a low groan of metal shifting, followed by the faint sound of digging. At dawn, his horse was gone. McAllister told the constable the man had ridden out before breakfast. Miss Hayes, however, found his bed still warm, and a small bloodstain beneath the mattress straw. Days later, a wagon carrying timber overturned near the river. Among the scattered boards, one plank bore strange marks, deep gouges almost like fingernail scrapes. The hauler who found it swore he'd seen McAllister hauling the same boards a week earlier. Fear spread through Gold Creek Hollow, though no one dared confront him. People on the frontier learned long ago that suspicion without proof could cost a man his life. The preacher, Reverend Claiborne, suggested prayer. The blacksmith quietly moved his family west. In her final surviving journal entry, dated September 2nd, Miss Hayes wrote, "He hums when he works below now. I hear it through the floorboards. The tune is not of church or tavern. It is steady, like a lullaby for the dead." That same week, the constable rode to Cheyenne to request a marshal's inspection, but storms delayed his return. By the time he arrived back, the saloon was shuttered, windows dark, and McAllister gone. Inside, the bar stood untouched, mugs still half-filled as though frozen in time. The cellar door, nailed shut, reeked faintly of rot. In later years, territorial papers would call it The Vanishing at Gold Creek, Hollow. Scholars comparing it to other unsolved crimes of the frontier. Era, a theme referenced again in Wikipedia's historical overview of Western expansion, as noted, how such stories slipped between record and rumor, leaving only whispers in their wake. To the locals who remained, one truth endured. Every time a lantern flickered in the Wyoming wind, it was said to echo the light that once glowed in McAllister's window, summoning those who would never leave again. By the turn of 1875, the once bustling track between Cheyenne and the northern claims had grown quieter. Wagonmen began steering clear of Gold Creek Hollow altogether. The place had developed a reputation, one that even the toughest frontiersmen found hard to ignore. "That hollow eats men," a trapper was heard saying in a saloon 2 towns over, "and that red-bearded devil feeds it." Constable Samuel Bingham, burdened by guilt and duty, finally secured a territorial marshal's support. The investigation that followed would be brief and inconclusive, but fragments of it remain in scattered county archives. According to testimony preserved in later reports, cross-referenced by historians studying the American frontier, as summarized in the Wikipedia reference on the American frontier, the marshal's party arrived at the saloon on a gray February morning. The door was barred from the outside. Inside, the air was heavy and wet, as though the building itself had been sweating through the winter. Miss Lillian Hayes was gone. Her belongings were found neatly folded on her bed, her journal missing several pages. On the table near the bar sat a cup of cold coffee and a single glove. Behind the counter, the cellar hatch had been pried open, the nails bent outward from within. Marshal Henry Voss, leading the search, later wrote, "The soil below was disturbed in several places, yielding fragments of bone and cloth, none complete enough for identification. In a small wooden crate near the stairs, they found glass bottles labeled chloroform and preserving spirits, alongside lengths of cord and a rusted hacksaw." Voss ordered the contents destroyed, fearing panic among the settlers. Outside, fresh wagon tracks led south toward the Laramie Plains. They followed for half a day before losing the trail in drifting snow. McAllister had vanished, leaving no trace of where he might have gone. For weeks, the townsfolk debated what to do with the building. Some argued to burn it, others to board it up. Reverend Claiborne urged restraint, saying, "A place haunted by sin deserves repentance, not flame." In the end, they sealed the cellar, hammered shut the windows and left it standing, a hollow monument to their collective dread. Yet even sealed, the saloon refused to stay quiet. Shepherds passing at night claimed to see lamplight flicker inside, long after the town was asleep. A ranch hand named Eli Carter told in later years that he once heard faint piano music drifting from within, though the saloon had never owned an instrument. The following spring, children dared each other to run up and touch the front door. One boy, Tommy Griggs, swore he heard someone whisper his name from inside. His father forbade him to go. Near the building again, historians reviewing these accounts, including scholars cited in the Wikipedia overview of the American frontier's isolated settlements, note how fear on the frontier often replaced justice. With law stretched thin and records burned or lost, stories like McAllister's lingered not as proof, but as warning. By late 1875, Gold Creek Hollow was nearly deserted. The church bell rusted, the blacksmith left, and the prairie began reclaiming the town plank by plank. Only the saloon remained upright, its sign half fallen, its door forever closed. Though some swore on moonless nights, it still creaked open to no hand at all. By the summer of 1876, the story of McAllister's house had spread far beyond the empty shell of Gold Creek Hollow. Newspapers from Cheyenne to Denver printed small, uncertain blurbs about missing travelers and a vanished innkeeper. Yet without a body, a trial or a clear suspect, the tale faded from headlines as quickly as it had surfaced. The West, hungry for progress and gold, left little room for remembrance. Still, whispers persisted. The old freight trail was avoided, though some prospectors, pressed by need, would cut through the valley for quicker passage. A few of them spoke later of a red-bearded man glimpsed at a distance standing among the ruins of the saloon, coat torn but posture composed. They said he watched them pass, then stepped backward into the shadows until nothing remained but dust. Constable Bingham resigned that autumn. His final note in the county docket read simply, "The hollow remains quiet. The wind speaks more than men do now. He later moved east and never returned. The American frontier, as many historians have since remarked, including in the Wikipedia reference on the American frontier, was a place where guilt and failure could vanish as completely as a body in snow. In 1878, the territory assigned surveyor Dr. Asa Corbin, a former physician turned geologist, to chart water sources through the region. His private field journal, preserved by his descendants, offers the only detailed postscript to the McAllister affair. Corbin wrote that upon reaching Gold Creek Hollow, he found the saloon still intact though leaning, its windows filmed with dust. He forced the door and described the interior as oddly preserved, as though expecting a guest's return. Cups still lined the shelves, and on the counter sat a tarnished silver watch engraved with the initials J.M. Corbin's journal, notes an odor beneath the floorboards. Not decay, but something chemical, sharp like medicine. When he pried open a corner of the cellar, he discovered empty bottles in a series of shallow pits, each carefully refilled. Inside one he found a single leather boot, hardened by time. The discovery disturbed him enough that he left by dusk, writing, "The hollow holds memory like damp earth. Once disturbed, it clings." By the 1880s, what remained of Gold Creek Hollow had been reclaimed by grass and silence. Travelers on the new railway line saw only a faint depression in the hills where the town once stood. Local ranchers referred to it as the quiet place. Still, occasional stories surfaced. A shepherd in 1886 claimed he'd seen lamplight moving within the ruins during a storm. Another in 1890 found footprints circling the site, bare, human, and recent. Though skeptics dismissed these as exaggerations, the accounts endured, becoming part of Wyoming's whispered folklore. Scholars looking back on these events a generation later, among them frontier chroniclers cited in Wikipedia's account of settlement-era disappearances, noted that such legends blurred seamlessly with truth. Isolation, they wrote, makes every shadow heavier, every silence more accusing. And so, long after the territory became a state, the story of Jonas McAllister survived only in fragments, a few journal pages, a forgotten report, and the chill that still touched travelers who happened to camp near the hollow. For even when the wind stilled, some swore they could hear a man humming softly underground, keeping time with the ghosts he'd made. By 1882, Wyoming had changed. Rail lines stretched farther west, telegraph wires stitched the plains, and towns with brick courthouses and painted churches rose where once there were only wagon ruts. Yet Gold Creek Hollow remained untouched, a scar the maps no longer named. The freight road that once passed its edge was rerouted after a landslide, and within a decade the place had slipped entirely from official charts. Only the oldest drovers remembered it, and even they spoke its name quietly. In that same year, a traveling journalist from the Cheyenne Daily Sun, Edwin Marlowe, ventured to the ruins after hearing miners speak of a ghost inn that drinks its own guests. Marlowe's surviving notebook, preserved today in the state archives, tells of his visit. He described the saloon as half-collapsed, its roof caved near the rear, yet the front door still hung stubbornly from one hinge. Inside, he wrote, the air feels neither dead nor living, only waiting. Marlowe noted that the cellar hatch had been torn open by animals or weather. He climbed down with a lantern and found what he called the odor of boiled tar and age. Near one wall lay a row of shapes covered by soil, too regular to be natural. He claimed not to have dug, saying, "If those are graves, the earth can keep its secrets." In his article, published that autumn, Marlowe compared the hollow to a wound that never healed from the days of the frontier, referencing how such sites embodied the darker side of Western expansion, a theme still echoed by historians today in the Wikipedia article on the American frontier. He ended with a warning to travelers. The road south of the Laramie Plains is cursed by kindness. When a stranger offers warmth there, decline. The story caused a brief sensation, sparking renewed interest among frontier folklorists and amateur detectives. One group of curiosity seekers from Denver organized an expedition to locate McAllister's supposed grave. Only 2 returned, claiming they'd lost their bearings when fog swallowed the valley. The others, they said, had gone in different directions and were never seen again. Whether they perished to exposure or vanished by other means was never proved. That same winter, a rancher named Jacob Fenner, living 20 miles east, reported finding an old trunk washed up near a frozen creek. Inside were receipts from McAllister's house and a ledger wrapped in oilcloth. The handwriting matched early descriptions from the constable's log. Most pages were ruined by damp, but a few legible lines remained. Guests forget. I remember for them. The house must not empty. The walls are patient. Historians, who later reviewed Fenner's account, some cited in academic references summarized within Wikipedia's overview of the frontier era, argue that the ledger's authenticity can't be verified. Yet even skeptics admitted its phrasing felt unnervingly intimate, as though written not by a man hiding his crimes, but by one trying to preserve them. After the trunk's discovery, treasure hunters and thrill-seekers flocked to the hollow for years, tearing up soil and scattering relics. None found anything more than bones of cattle and old timber, but the legend endured, its roots deep as the prairie frost. For every artifact lost, the whispers seemed to grow stronger. And always, they said, on still nights, one could hear a man's quiet hum rising from the ground, steady, rhythmic, and terribly human. By the late 1880s, Gold Creek Hollow had taken on a second life, not as a settlement but as a story. The few who still spoke of it did so around campfires somewhere between whiskey and fear. To young cowhands and trail cooks, the tale of the saloon keeper's song became a warning whispered along the cattle routes. They said if you passed near the old creek bed after midnight, you could hear a man humming beneath the ground, a tune slow and warm, like a lullaby meant to calm the dead. In 1888, a professor of anthropology from the University of Denver, Dr. Leonard Clay, heard of the story while collecting oral traditions from ranchers. Fascinated, he decided to verify the site himself. His official report to the Territorial Historical Society, fragments of which survive today, described a landscape eerily preserved, the windless sort of place where the earth itself seems to listen. He found no saloon standing, only a few buried timbers and rusted nails, but nearby he discovered remnants of foundation stone, blackened by old fire. Dr. Clay compared the site's layout with sketches of early Wyoming settlements, later referencing how similar ghost towns across the American frontier often carried rumors of buried crimes or mass graves, parallels still documented by historians in the Wikipedia article on the American frontier. He concluded that while superstition clouded the Hollow's story, the pattern of vanishings follows too neat a rhythm to dismiss as myth. Among the papers found in Clay's field satchel was a strange transcript, an interview with an elderly trapper named Silas Boone, who claimed to have known McAllister personally. Boone recalled that McAllister had a way of talking to the walls, as if expecting them to answer. He swore that one night in 1874, after too much whiskey, McAllister confided that his saloon was hungry, and that when the cellar filled with silence, he had to feed it again. Clay dismissed this as frontier madness, but included it in his notes out of academic obligation. 2 months after his report was filed, Clay vanished while returning east. His mule and wagon were later found near Medicine Bow, supplies untouched. No trace of the man himself was ever discovered. The Cheyenne Ledger ran a short article titled, "Scholar Lost on Trail, Hollow Strikes Again." The editor later admitted he printed it for drama, yet even skeptics avoided the subject thereafter. Through the 1890s, as the territory grew into statehood, Gold Creek Hollow became an unofficial taboo. Survey maps left it unmarked. Mail coaches rerouted. One railway engineer, James R. Lowen, insisted the valley's soil was unstable and advised against laying track near it. Whether from superstition or prudence, the company complied. Still, curiosity lingered. Travelers heading west occasionally detoured to see what remained. They found little, just open grass, shallow depressions, and the stubborn shape of stone that once framed a doorway. Yet some claimed that when wind passed through that gap, it carried a low humming tone too, even to be chance. Scholars referencing these accounts a century later as noted in the Wikipedia discussions on folklore of the frontier, identified the Hollow as one of the earliest American legends blending recorded crime with supernatural suggestion. But for those who lived in Wyoming then, it wasn't legend. It was simply a place best left alone. When the new century dawned in 1901, most who had known Gold Creek Hollow were gone or gray. Wyoming had changed. Electric lamps flickered in Cheyenne. Rail depots pulsed with trade, and the myth of the frontier had begun to fade into memory. Yet in the quiet corners of the state, among ranches and mining camps, people still spoke the name McAllister with a kind of respectful unease. That year, an itinerant photographer named Harold Klein set out to document abandoned settlements for an illustrated almanac. His surviving glass negatives, now housed in a Cheyenne archive, include several of the Hollows Valley, a shallow depression half choked with sage, with one leaning post jutting from the soil like a broken rib. On the back of one photograph, Klein penciled a short caption, "Light visible in cellar." No explanation. Local accounts say that Klein camped there overnight, determined to capture the ruins by dawn. His diary, found decades later, contained this passage. At 2 past midnight, I was woken by a faint hum from below the ground. It was steady, deliberate. I thought perhaps a wire, but there is no telegraph here. The sound grew softer as I approached the cellar pit. It seemed to breathe. Klein's final entry ended abruptly after describing a yellow glow emanating from the hole where the saloon once stood. He was never seen again. His mule was found grazing a mile away, harness intact, camera missing. At the time, newspapers chalked it up to exposure, but a columnist for the Laramie Republican, writing in 1902, connected Klein's disappearance to earlier reports from the American frontier period, citing the strange continuity between McAllister's legend and other unsolved vanishings in remote outposts, a connection later echoed in the Wikipedia entry on the American frontier. He wrote, "The hollow remains a mouth that swallows evidence and spits only rumor. Progress has crossed it, but not erased it." By 1905, Gold Creek Hollow was formally designated abandoned territory. No new settlers applied for claim rights. Yet postal riders continued to report discomfort passing through the region. One carrier, Joseph Miles, noted that his horse refused to cross the old wagon path, snorting and backing away. Miles described hearing what he called a man's tune whistled slow, as though someone worked in rhythm with it. He was not alone. 2 surveyors later corroborated similar accounts that same season. In 1910, a small fire swept through the surrounding hills. When ranchers arrived to contain it, they found that the flames had stopped precisely at the edge of the old saloon site, leaving the earth inside untouched, as if spared deliberately. A local newspaper joked that hell refuses its own. Few laughed, even decades later. Historians reflecting on these tales, particularly those summarized in the Wikipedia overview of folklore and settlement, Myths of the American Frontier, noted that Gold Creek Hollow served as a psychological boundary, a point where recorded history yielded to silence. And perhaps that is what McAllister wanted most, to be remembered not in records or trials, but in that fragile space between fact and fear. A man who turned hospitality into ritual, and whose house, even long destroyed, seemed unwilling to let its guests depart. By 1912, the name Gold Creek Hollow had become a kind of shorthand among Wyoming locals for anything unlucky or unexplainable. Farmers would mutter, "That's hollow business," when tools vanished or cattle turned up lame. It was no longer a place, they said. It was a presence, something that moved quiet and wide like wind under the earth. That summer, a writer for Frontier Monthly, Clara Wendell, decided to revisit the legend for a series called Terrors of the Old West. She arrived with a hired guide, Benjamin Ruth, and spent 3 nights camping on the ridge above the former town site. Her letters to the magazine's editor, preserved and later quoted by regional historians, offer the last first-hand description before the area was closed to settlement. In her first letter, Wendell described a stillness so dense it feels like a held breath. She noted that even the insects were absent at dusk. "No sound but wind," she wrote, "and sometimes not even that." On the second night, she and Ruth explored the depression where the saloon had stood. They found bits of brick, a collapsed doorway, and a faint outline of steps descending into what must have been the cellar. Wendell claimed the air below was unnaturally cool, though no cave system existed nearby. Ruth, an experienced tracker, refused to remain after sundown. In her journal, Wendell recorded his words, "Ma'am, places keep memory. This one don't forget friendly." That final night, Wendell awoke to what she described as a single low note, like someone humming into the earth. She called for Ruth, but his bedroll was empty. His horse and provisions remained. She searched until dawn, finding only a trail of boot prints leading toward the dry creek. They ended abruptly, as if erased. Wendell returned alone to Cheyenne, shaken but alive. Her article, published early 1913, treated the hollow with academic restraint but unmistakable fear. She cited old testimonies, including the American frontier disappearances from earlier decades, drawing on the same historical continuity outlined later in the Wikipedia reference on the American frontier. She wrote, "Where isolation was once the price of freedom, it became instead the shadow that swallowed men whole." After its publication, the area was quietly purchased by a mining consortium, one that, curiously, never extracted a single ounce of ore. Locals believed it was an attempt to seal the land permanently. A crude wire fence appeared, stretching across the ridge, and new maps marked the site as restricted property. No official explanation was given. In 1917, a small earthquake rattled the plains. Ranchers reported hearing what they called a moan of earth, as if wind were trapped beneath the ground. For several nights afterward, faint light was seen rising from the hollow, flickering amber and dying out again. The last surviving record comes from a telegraph operator in Laramie who logged a faint static pattern at 3:12 a.m. on the night of the quake. The notation beside it read simply, "Signal humming, continuous human pitch." Decades later, historians would call Gold Creek Hollow an acoustic legend, a phenomenon born of guilt, geology, and ghost story combined. But for those who lived near it, especially in those early Wyoming years, the line between folklore and fact never really existed. As the Wikipedia discussions on frontier myths suggest, such stories persist because the land itself remembers what people cannot bear to record. By the early 1920s, Gold Creek Hollow existed only in fragments, old county records, yellowing articles, and a few blurred photographs. Wyoming had entered a modern age of automobiles, telephones, and state fairs. But even as progress rolled westward, the hollow's silence endured like an old wound. Ranchers avoided it, railmen swore by it, and surveyors quietly left the area unmeasured. In 1921, a state archivist named Henry Dallow, newly assigned to Cheyenne's historical office, stumbled upon a sealed box marked Unverified Incidents, Laramie Region. Inside lay the surviving fragments of Constable Bingham's 1870s notes, Miss Lillian Hayes's recovered journal pages, and 2 brittle telegrams from Marshal Voss. Dallow, meticulous by nature, began cataloguing the materials. What he found unsettled him. The first telegram, sent February 21st, 1875, read, "Found evidence of graves. Stop proceeding with extreme caution. Stop request authorization to exhume. Stop." The second, never officially filed, was addressed to a Denver contact. "The earth here is too soft. Stop. Every hole fills itself. Stop. Do not come." Intrigued, Dallow wrote an essay titled The Vanishing at Gold Creek Hollow, a Study in Frontier Fear. He cross-referenced every name and date he could, using new estate ledgers and local family archives. The resulting paper was published in the Wyoming Historical Review later that year, where it drew both praise and disbelief. In his conclusion, Dallow noted that the American frontier had not merely created legends, it had created absences. He cited statistics from the late 19th century, estimating that over 1,000 recorded travelers vanished between Kansas and Montana with no final record. As he explained, the land remembers by omission. His argument echoed ideas later summarized in the Wikipedia entry on the American frontier, which observes how distance and isolation blurred the border between truth and rumor in frontier life. Weeks after his article's release, Dallow reportedly began receiving anonymous letters. Each was unsigned, written in faint pencil, and contained only one line. "The house remembers you now." He dismissed them as pranks until he noticed that the envelopes bore no postmarks. In the winter of 1922, Dallow vanished while traveling to Laramie for a speaking engagement. His automobile was found abandoned near the foothills, engine still warm, headlights dim. Investigators noted that his trunk contained maps of the old hollow and a hand-drawn sketch of the Saloon Foundation. No trace of him was ever recovered. Newspapers dubbed it the archivist's curse, though skeptics blamed the snowstorm that swept through that same night. Still, whispers persisted. Telegraph operators claimed their lines hummed faintly between 3 and 4 in the morning, like a low cord held too long. Historians reflecting on the event decades later, particularly those cited in the Wikipedia overview of American Frontier, Folklore and Hauntings, suggested that Dallo's obsession exemplified the era's lingering unease with its own past. The frontier, they argued, had moved on physically but never spiritually, and so the hollow endured, unseen, unmarked, but not forgotten, a place where paper records ended, and the earth itself continued the story, one slow hum at a time. By 1923, the legend of Gold Creek Hollow had become the sort of tale told only when lamps burned low. Wyoming had grown modern, roads paved, radios humming, but superstition still clung to the state's bones. When ranchers spoke of lost cattle or failing crops, they would mutter that the hollow's breath was on the wind. That autumn, a research team from the University of Wyoming organized a geological survey through the southern basins. Among them was Dr. Margaret Ellis, one of the first women geologists in the territory. Practical, skeptical, and fascinated by local folklore, she persuaded her supervisor to let her include the hollow in their mapping route. "If it's a hole in the ground," she told a reporter, "then geology, not ghosts, can explain it." Ellis's field notes, archived decades later, read with the precision of science tinged by unease. She described the terrain as unnaturally subsiding, as though the valley floor had been scooped out beneath itself. Her instruments recorded faint tremors, inconsistent with known fault lines. "The ground hums at intervals," she wrote, "a vibration perceptible through the soles of one's boots, but not through the air." She compared this to other reports from isolated western settlements, territories where the American frontier had pushed human endurance to its limits, and silence often concealed tragedy. Her later reflections, quoted in university journals and eventually referenced in the Wikipedia article on the American frontier, linked such vibrations to abandoned mine shafts or collapsed storage pits. But in her private notebook she added one unsettling line: "No shaft found, no void. The sound moves as if alive." During her second night at camp, Ellis and her assistant Walter Pike heard what they first took for thunder, though the sky was clear. The noise rose from beneath the soil in a long, even tone, steady enough to be measured on her barograph paper. Pike panicked, insisting they leave by dawn. Ellis convinced him to remain one more day. That decision would mark her final recorded entry. On October 19, 1923, the survey's main party found their camp abandoned. The instruments were still set, notebooks stacked neatly beside the tent. Of the two scientists there was no sign, only a single pickaxe, blade buried in the earth where the sound had last been noted. Local authorities searched for weeks before declaring the case closed. Official cause: disappearance due to terrain instability. Unofficially, the region was declared unsafe and struck from the survey registry. No further academic expeditions were approved. In the years that followed, Ellis's colleagues cited her final findings cautiously. Some suggested subsurface gas vents, others seismic anomalies. Yet when later historians analyzed her notes, especially those portions cross-referenced in studies summarized within Wikipedia's overview of frontier-era folklore, they observed that her tone shifted from analytical to almost reverent, as though she believed she was documenting not geology, but memory. By 1924, the federal maps removed Gold Creek Hollow entirely. The coordinates still existed, but the name was gone, replaced by blank topography. Travelers passing through that stretch of prairie reported that their engines sputtered, compasses spun, and silence deepened until even their own voices felt muffled. The frontier had ended, at least on paper, but in Wyoming some boundaries were never meant to close. By 1924, the state finally declared the basin around Gold Creek Hollow environmentally unstable. That phrase, clinical, precise, appeared in a single line of a Wyoming geological bulletin and nowhere else. But among locals it was taken to mean cursed. No rancher wanted the grazing rights, and even oil companies that had leased half the county left that corner untouched. Still, curiosity has its own gravity. In early spring of 1925, a journalist from the Rocky Mountain Chronicle named Frank Hollis set out to revisit the forgotten ground. He hoped to write what he called a rational obituary for an irrational legend. Hollis had spent years chronicling frontier crimes. He prided himself on separating fact from folklore. He carried with him an old hand-drawn map, 2 cameras, and a revolver, For coyotes, he told the liveryman who lent him the horse. Hollis reached the hollow after 2 days of travel. His field diary survives in part. The first pages are orderly, his handwriting neat. Arrived at dusk, he wrote. Nothing here but silence and a depression of ground perhaps 40 feet deep. No scent of sulfur, no sign of habitation. Then, in later pages, the sentences grow shorter, erratic. Wind not moving. Soil vibrates faintly. Feels like breath underfoot. He photographed the ridgeline and, according to later analysis, captured faint streaks of light near the basin floor. Too straight to be lightning, too narrow for campfire smoke. That negative was never developed fully. When discovered years later, the emulsion had melted into a pale, human-shaped blur. Back in Cheyenne, Hollis's editor received a telegram dated March 17, 1925. Story nearly done. The house still stands, sort of. Tell them the floor hums. It was his last message. A search party found his horse 3 days later, reins torn, eyes wide as if spooked to blindness. Hollis's gear lay scattered nearby. His notebook had been buried deliberately beneath a stone, as though meant to be found. Historians later connected his account to earlier disappearances, noting that even in the 20th century, remnants of the American frontier, that landscape of half law and half legend, persisted in isolated Wyoming basins. Scholars analyzing his notes, including those cited in the Wikipedia entry on the American frontier, pointed out that he described the hollow in language nearly identical to 1870s witnesses. Clean air, no wind, soft ground. Decades apart, the pattern had not changed. After Hollis's death, state authorities fenced off the site again. A brief government memo recorded the reason as subsurface hazard due to sinkage, but within a year, surveyors noticed something peculiar. The ground inside the fence rose slightly each season as though exhaling. Measurements confirmed a swelling of nearly 2 inches by 1926, though no geological source could explain it. By then, locals refused to speak of the place. Stage drivers detoured 15 miles rather than cross the ridge. Some said the hum could still be heard on cold mornings, resonating through the fence posts like a muted cello string. Scholars reviewing these final reports, among them later cultural historians, whose summaries appear in Wikipedia's coverage of frontier folklore, call Gold Creek hollow a memory sink, a point where the old frontier's silence concentrated and never dispersed. And perhaps that is what it was, not haunted but remembering. Even now, when snow sweeps the plains and the wind dies for a breath too long, those who listen claim to hear that same low tone rising from the frozen ground, steady, patient, and unending. By the spring of 1926, Gold Creek Hollow had become less a story than a superstition woven into the state's quiet places. Road crews refused contracts that took them within 10 miles of the basin. Even the new motor tourists, men with goggles, and Packards chasing the open road, would glance at the blank spot on their maps and steer elsewhere. It was, as one editor for the Casper Tribune put it, a hole in geography. That same year, the University of Wyoming received a sealed packet from an anonymous sender containing several of Jonas McAllister's supposed personal effects. A brass room key tagged No. 3, a cracked mirror fragment, and a folded scrap of ledger paper. The handwriting matched known samples from the 1870s Saloon register. Across the page, in uneven ink, was written, "The house hums when full." No provenance was established, yet the parcel revived public fascination. The university's anthropology department commissioned Professor Elias Bard, a young folklorist, to document remaining oral accounts. His paper, The Persistent Myth of Gold Creek Hollow, became a foundational text for later cultural studies. Bard approached the legend skeptically, framing it as a remnant of the American frontier mindset, how isolation bred stories to explain disappearances. In his field notes, later summarized in the Wikipedia article on the American frontier, he observed, "Frontier fear survives by repetition. Each generation retells it until it feels historical." Bard interviewed dozens of elderly settlers. Many denied ever visiting the hollow, but spoke of that humming place with nervous precision. One former post rider, Emmett Cole, recalled hearing vibrations through his saddle while crossing the ridge in 1880, like someone plucking a wire stretched under the dirt. Another, Mrs. Nora Griggs, said her brother vanished there after boasting he'd dig up the innkeeper's treasure. She claimed that when his friends searched, they found the earth newly smoothed, as though hands had patted it down from below. In July 1926, Bard ventured to the site with a local guide. His journal records that the land appeared undisturbed, no buildings, only faint mounds tracing a square foundation. He set a phonograph cylinder near the center to capture ambient sound overnight. At dawn, he returned to find the cylinder cracked and the recorder needle bent backward. The wax fragment, when replayed later in Laramie, produced a single sustained tone, low, rhythmic, unmistakably human. Bard refused to return. His published article described the event in careful academic language, subsonic resonance of uncertain origin. Privately, he wrote to a colleague that he felt watched by the soil itself. He resigned from the university within the year and moved east, never again publishing on folklore. Historians reviewing Bard's notes decades later, particularly those cited in Wikipedia's overview of frontier-era cultural phenomena, remarked on how methodical skepticism eroded into belief. What began as an attempt to close a legend instead extended it. Each new investigation became part of the myth's architecture, another beam in McAllister's invisible house. By the decade's end, the hollow's coordinates were fenced for good under federal reclamation law. The prairie grew back, swallowing the posts, but travelers still reported hearing faint hums vibrating through their tires on the old road, like the heartbeat of the land, remembering every name it took. By 1927, official silence had replaced curiosity. The state's reclamation office issued a short circular. Public entry to the Gold Creek Hollow Tract is restricted until further geological assessment. No assessment ever followed. Fencing crews posted warnings, then left them to rust. The hollow was once again surrendered to the wind. That winter, a rail engineer named Alfred Hume logged a peculiar event while maintaining telegraph lines along the southern corridor. Between 3:00 and 3:20 a.m., his instruments picked up a sustained tone that traveled the entire stretch of wire, steady, even, and faintly melodic. He described it as neither mechanical nor atmospheric. The signal stopped exactly when his train passed the coordinates where Gold Creek Hollow would have been. Hume's supervisor dismissed it as feedback, but the record remains in the company ledger. Around the same time, the Cheyenne Star printed a small column titled Echo from the Old Frontier. It revisited the McAllister legend, suggesting the phenomenon might be linked to underground gas vents or shifting clay. The writer quoted a line from Professor Elias Bard's earlier work: "The earth hums when memory is forced to hold too much." The piece drew letters from readers recalling family stories of the missing innkeeper and his guests. One elderly miner insisted his father had helped bury the cellar after the Marshall search in 1875. "We packed it tight," he wrote, "but the ground still breathed." By 1928, Gold Creek Hollow was reclassified as closed basin land. A short government memo noted minor seismic irregularities. Modern historians reviewing that entry, some cited later in the Wikipedia article on the American frontier, point out how bureaucratic understatement often masked unease. The same phrase appeared in reports from other frontier disappearances, later mythologized. In early spring, a photographer for the Wyoming Historical Review, Cliff Parson, obtained a one-day pass to document the restricted zone before it was sealed indefinitely. His surviving notes describe clear skies and a strange absence of echo. The valley swallows sound whole. Even my own footsteps end halfway. Parson took 6 photographs, only 3 of which survived a darkroom fire weeks later. The negatives show nothing unusual, just prairie grass and low mounds, but exposure experts noticed faint horizontal bands of distortion near the image center, like ripples across water. After Parsons' visit, the hollow vanished again, this time beneath official neglect. Fences fell, markers disappeared, and the prairie rolled unbroken. Yet rail workers continued to report the same midnight tone. Telegraph operators in Rock River swore their wires sang once every few months, always during the thaw. Folklorists of the American frontier period, whose reflections appear today in summaries on Wikipedia, came to regard Gold Creek Hollow as the archetype of a legend without witnesses. Each generation rediscovered it, tried to rationalize it, and then recoiled into silence. By decade's end, the last direct reference to the hollow in Wyoming records appears in a 1929 weather bulletin. Unusual ground resonance reported in uninhabited southern basin, no damage. After that, nothing. The archives go quiet, so quiet that historians later joked. The Earth itself had filed a final report. Still, travelers along the old telegraph line sometimes pause when the wind falls. For a moment they swear they hear wire and soil vibrating together, low and human, as if a buried saloon were still open for one last guest. By 1929, the Great Depression had begun to shadow the country, but in Wyoming's lonely basins, the change hardly registered. Poverty was already a familiar companion. Few remembered Gold Creek Hollow as a real place. To most, it had become a fireside ghost, a story told when blizzards sealed doors and the radio's crackle faded. Yet that same year, a man named Raymond Kettner, a road surveyor for the Works Progress Administration, found himself charting new routes through southern Wyoming. Kettner was a practical man, educated in Denver, and he had never heard of the hollow. He marked his maps by elevation, drew neat pencil lines, and trusted theodolites more than tales. In September, his team camped near a flat stretch of prairie that appeared featureless. At sunset, their compasses began to drift 3 degrees off north. The men joked about magnetic devils, but when Kettner checked again by lantern light, the needle still wavered. One worker swore he heard faint whistling carried by the wind, a single even pitch. Kettner noted it in his log with irritation. Unidentified resonance from ground, not wind. Duration, 2 minutes. The next morning they found the soil around their stakes had sunk nearly an inch overnight. No quake was reported anywhere in the state. When they broke camp, Kettner scratched one last remark in his notebook. "This place hums when left alone. The entry ends there." A week later, a mail truck discovered the survey wagon overturned near the ridge. Supplies scattered, horses gone, no sign of the men. The only intact item was Kettner's level rod, buried point down as if planted deliberately. Investigators concluded it was an accident, though no tracks led away. Afterward, state officials quietly excluded that sector from the road plans. Internal correspondence, still viewable in state archives and referenced in modern studies summarized in the Wikipedia article on the American frontier, shows the reluctance in plain language. Ground unreliable. Public works not advised. The case drew one last round of newspaper attention under the headline "Surveyors Lost in Singing Valley." The story connected the event to the old McAllister legend, reviving curiosity long buried. Letters flooded in, retelling family memories of the innkeeper, the cellar, and the strange hum beneath the earth. One correspondent, an elderly woman from Laramie who claimed descent from Miss Lillian Hayes's sister, wrote, "He promised she would never be alone and the house would stay full. Maybe it still is." Folklorists, revisiting the case in later decades, including those cited in the Wikipedia overview of frontier folklore, treated the hollow as the last gasp of 19th century isolation myths. They argued it symbolized guilt for the forgotten dead of westward expansion. Yet some researchers quietly admitted the consistency across every era was uncanny. From 1874 to 1929, witnesses described the same sound, the same trembling ground, the same sense of a structure that no longer stood but somehow persisted. By winter's end, the basin had disappeared again under snow. The state completed its highway detour 15 miles east, leaving the hollow unmarked, unreachable, and unspoken. It had outlasted the frontier, the marshals, the miners, and even memory itself, still humming faintly beneath a country that refused to listen. When 1930 arrived, the new decade brought dust, drought, and a kind of silence that suited Wyoming well. The land had begun to forget its own stories, or at least to stop telling them aloud. Yet even silence leaves traces. That spring, a team of engineers from the Union Pacific Railroad began inspecting dormant telegraph lines along the southern route. The project was routine maintenance. Remove obsolete poles, clear brush, and document terrain. Among the crew was Thomas Beale, a young draftsman from Omaha, meticulous and curious. He was the one who first noticed that one of the abandoned lines ended abruptly near an uncharted basin. Beale and two linemen followed the track until it vanished in a shallow depression. It looked like a lake had once sat there, he later wrote in a short company memo. Only grass now, but the soil feels hollow underfoot. He recorded faint vibrations when he placed his ear to the ground, steady, rhythmic, too constant to be mere wind. The others refused to stay. That evening, Beale camped alone to finish his sketches. At midnight, he claimed the telegraph wire, long disconnected from power, began to hum. It carried a tone, he noted, not mechanical, more like a man at work below. In the morning, the sound ceased. Beale left the site shaken but unharmed. His report, filed in June 1930, was never published. Company officials marked it unverified anomaly. Later folklorists, referencing that memo decades afterward in essays summarized within the Wikipedia article on the American frontier, considered it one of the last credible modern observations tied to the hollow. They saw in Beale's account the lingering shadow of the frontier's unfinished narrative, where technology met old superstition, and neither quite won. That same summer, a regional drought exposed the basin floor for the first time in living memory. A pilot flying mail between Laramie and Rock Springs photographed the area from above. The prints, now stored in the Wyoming archives, revealed faint geometric impressions across the soil, rectangular outlines, unnaturally precise. One researcher later identified them as foundations consistent with an 1870s saloon layout. The discovery reignited speculation that the hollow's remains were resurfacing. Locals, however, wanted no part of it. One rancher told a reporter, "The ground there opens when it's hungry, then shuts again. Let it be." When another dust storm swept through in 1931, the outlines vanished once more. By then, only a handful of people even remembered Jonas McAllister's name. But for historians of the American frontier, his legend endured as a parable of distance, of what happens when isolation becomes identity. Writers summarizing his story in modern references, such as those cited in Wikipedia's discussions of frontier myth and settlement law, argue that the hollow embodied the last echo of a nation still haunted by the cost of expansion. Beale retired in 1952, never returning to Wyoming. Yet in his final years, he told his grandson a peculiar detail omitted from his official report, that on his last night by the basin, he heard a faint clinking sound, like glasses being set on a wooden bar, followed by a man's voice whispering, "Another round." The boy laughed it off then, but when asked years later, he admitted his grandfather's eyes had been wet when he told it. By 1931, whatever remained of Gold Creek Hollow was less a location than an omission. Surveyors drew straight lines over the basin, and cartographers filled the empty space with neutral beige. To erase a place, it seemed, all one had to do was stop naming it. That spring, the Wyoming State Museum mounted an exhibit titled The Vanishing Frontier. Among glass cases of pistols and wagon tools, one small display contained a warped signboard fragment that read only, "Lister's Hoe." It had been found during the previous year's drought and quietly donated. Visitors walked past it without notice until a janitor reported that the wood hummed when the building settled at night. The curator dismissed it as vibration from the streetcars outside, but when the city replaced the tracks, the sound continued. Archivists later linked the artifact to the saloon's presumed location. Theories multiplied: underground acoustics, temperature shifts, collective imagination. The curator, Dr. Susan Lane, catalogued the sign and locked it in storage. In her report, she added a peculiar note: "When the humming stops, the air feels heavier." Meanwhile, old-timers in Laramie still traded the story as local truth. Freight drivers claimed their engines lost spark when crossing the old route. Ranch hands told of hearing a tune beneath the rattle of their wagons, a tune without beginning or end. A preacher from Rawlins even declared the hollow a wound left open by the sins of hospitality. His sermon was printed once, then withdrawn at his own request. Historians reviewing these fragments decades later, particularly those referenced in the Wikipedia article on the American frontier, saw the pattern clearly. Every generation reshaped the tale to fit its fears. In the 1870s, it was lawlessness. In the 1890s, guilt. By the 1930s, it had become the dread of forgetting itself. Yet across all retellings, the hum remained. Whatever it was, it did not age. In 1932, a brief earthquake shook southern Wyoming. Though mild, it cracked the basement wall of the museum where the McAllister's house sign was stored. Workers clearing debris claimed they heard a low-tone echo through the vents, as if something wooden was sighing. When the curator returned the next day, the fragment had split neatly in two, grain clean, no splintering. She resigned shortly after, leaving a final remark in the museum ledger. The board still remember the weight of the room. By year's end, newspapers ceased mentioning the hollow. The depression deepened, and the nation had other ghosts to chase. Trains thundered across the plains, telegraph poles rotted away, and modern Wyoming rolled forward as though the legend had never existed. Yet a few travelers still reported peculiar nights along the old southern road, nights when even engines seemed to idle themselves, as though listening. Modern researchers studying those accounts, among them folklorists cited in Wikipedia's overview of frontier myths and memory culture, remark that McAllister's story functions less as haunting and more as echo. The persistence of sound after its source is gone. If that's true, perhaps the hollow was never cursed at all. Perhaps it merely remembered too much and could not stop speaking. By 1933, the last direct trace of Gold Creek Hollow slipped quietly into legend. A nationwide census that year listed no residents, no property, and no coordinates matching the old records. It was as if the place had been erased not by nature, but by consensus. Everyone simply agreed it was gone. And yet, absence has a way of being noticed. That spring, an oil prospector named John Carrow filed a complaint, with the state claiming that his surveying instruments malfunctioned near the southern ridge due to harmonic interference. He described a deep vibration running through the ground that disrupted his compass and made his chest ache. His report, stored in a forgotten county box, ended with a line underlined twice. Sound resembles human voice, low, continuous, in key of F. Carrow never drilled there. He sold his rights for $1 and left the state. The buyer never followed up. The ridge remained untouched. By the late 1930s, the Federal Works Program graded new highways across southern Wyoming. One construction foreman noted in his log that the soil near mile marker 212 was too soft for foundation, though tests showed it perfectly dry. He rerouted the road half a mile east. Later aerial photos, quietly archived, occasionally referenced by historians studying the American frontier and its vanishing towns, show a faint depression still marking the old site. Her footnote in those same studies, summarized in the Wikipedia article on the American frontier, observes that many lost settlements disappeared not through disaster, but through deliberate forgetting. The hollow fit that pattern too well. As the years passed, the story settled into a kind of collective dream. Children heard it as a fireside warning. Travelers treated it as a ghost story. Scholars filed it under unverified folklore, but among locals one detail persisted: the hum. Ranchers driving cattle across the plains would pause on still mornings, claiming the ground beneath their boots carried a tone so faint it could almost be mistaken for breath. Some said it pulsed with their heartbeats. In 1940, a farmer rebuilding a fence near the area dug up what appeared to be a small iron key tagged 3. He tossed it aside, thinking it junk, until his dog began howling at nothing visible. That night, he heard what he called singing from under the porch. He moved his family north a week later. Historians decades later, particularly those whose analyses echo through the Wikipedia overview of frontier, folklore and memory, would write that Gold Creek Hollow symbolized America's unfinished conversation with its own wilderness, the part of the frontier that refused to die even when the land was mapped, named, and fenced. The hum, they suggested, was not supernatural but psychological, a sound made by guilt, carried by wind through time. But locals never spoke of psychology. They said the saloon still stood underground, its lamps burning steady, the tables set for guests who would never leave. And if you knelt to the soil at dusk, you could still feel it, warm, pulsing, alive. The ground, they said, was not haunted. It was simply remembering. And so ends the story of Jonas McAllister, the saloon keeper whose hospitality never closed. The hollow sleeps somewhere under the Wyoming plains, patient as ever, waiting for footsteps to cross its floor again. When the wind falls silent and the earth hums low, perhaps it already has,